Welcome to the Space for Diplomacy podcast by Spaceport Sarabhai, India's space policy think tank. I'm your host, Susmita Mohanty. This podcast series features conversations on far-ranging topics such as geopolitics, tech diplomacy, international cooperation, and all things space. Today, I'll be speaking with Victoria Samson, who is joining me for this conversation from Washington, D.C. We hope to discuss, among other things, space security and sustainability, US's Golden Dome missile defense, nuclear weapons and arms control, counterspace tech, and the future of space warfare. Victoria, welcome to the Space for Diplomacy podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Susmita.
Victoria Samson is the Chief Director of Space Security and Stability for Secure World Foundation and has more than 25 years of experience in military space and security issues. Before joining Secure World Foundation, Victoria served as a Senior Analyst for the Center for Defense Information, or CDI, where she leveraged her expertise in missile defense, nuclear reductions, and space security issues to conduct in-depth analysis and media commentary. Prior to her time at CDI, Victoria was a Senior Policy Associate at the Coalition to Reduce Nuclear Dangers, a consortium of arms control groups in the Washington, D.C. area. Victoria was the head of the Security Task Force of the International Astronautical Federation. She is a member of the Space Security Working Group of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Committee on International Security and Arms Control. Victoria holds a bachelor's degree in political science from UCLA and a master's in international relations from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Victoria, to set the context for our conversation, can you define space security for our listeners?
Yeah, Susmita, that's a really good question. And I don't know that there is one common definition of what space security is. I think a lot of it is in the eye of the beholder. You could look at kind of big picture space security. It looks at the ability, I guess it depends on who's asking, right? For the United States, space security might be something like, okay, the ability to continue to get the benefits and use of space unimpeded by adversaries or things like that. Other actors might look at space security as, okay, we want to make sure no one puts weapons in space. And the way we want to go about doing that is we're going to have a treaty banning the placement of weapons in space. So I think a lot of it just kind of depends. Big picture, I would say space security is looking at the security and stability of the space domain so there is not conflict in space that leads to conflict on Earth. Or alternatively, you don't have conflict or instability in Earth leading to conflict in space.
Tell us a bit about the United States' current approach to space security policy and the architecture that aligns with that kind of thinking.
Sure. There's been a shift over the past decade or so, I would say. Space has never been a sanctuary. There's always been the threat of conflict in space. I mean, that's what drove the United States and the Soviet Union to the moon, was the idea of geopolitical competition putting us into space. The first anti-satellite test was held by the United States in 1959. The first one by the Soviets was 1963. So this is not necessarily new, the idea of conflict in space. But I think the approach has changed a lot. And part of that has to deal with in terms of how much the United States and other countries really depend upon space for national security missions, for how their economies function, how our societies function, in terms of depending on GPS and things like that. So over the past 10 years, there's been a real shift. The pendulum has swung towards the United States first not really wanting to talk about space being a warfighting domain to, there's been a discussion about how to handle, again, in the United States, military space acquisition. It was divided across a bunch of different organizations. And so there was a discussion for a long time about how best to handle that. Should it be a space guard, kind of like the Coast Guard, but like for space? Should there be a space force? Should there be a space corps, kind of like the Marine Corps, but for space? So there are a lot of discussions. This is not new, but I would say about 10 years ago, it kind of took a head, and the idea kind of coalesced behind some sort of space force or a space guard or something like some sort of military organization whose job is specifically space. So they're the ones in charge of it, as opposed to previously it was spread out across a lot of the other armed forces. President Trump announced in 2019 and a space policy directive that the United States is going to create a space force. And so we stepped up. We had a space command that we stepped down in 2002. That got restarted in 2019. And then the space force got started in 2019. The idea of organizing, training, equipment, and equipping forces to be able to, for the U.S. to be able to use space. So that was kind of the jumpstart there in 2019. And at the same time as well, I will point out other countries were also starting military space organizations. So this is not a topic or a concern that is specific to the United States. Russia and China both started military space organizations in 2015 and 2016. India started up its kind of military space organization, started in 2018, came into force 2019. France, Japan started theirs in 2019. The UK, Australia, they've all started relative kind of space command in the past couple of years. So this is an overall trend that's happening. Going back to the U.S. though, because that's what you asked me about. So we started our Space Force in 2019, and then there's been an increasingly comfortable, I think, shift in terms of, or a shift in comfort in terms of talking about space being a warfighting domain. And that's really within the past year and a half or so, where the U.S. has really openly spoken about that. And so the idea that the United States wants to be able to, be freedom from attack in space, freedom to attack in space, and freedom to keep our adversaries from getting the benefits or being able to use space in that sort of a way. So you see, like in terms of policy documents, this past spring, the United States Space Force released the Warfighting Framework, which kind of talks about the idea of space superiority and ways in which to achieve that, objectives and how to go about in terms of offensive and defensive capabilities. Just a week or two ago, they released the Space Force Vector 2025, which talks about, again, how to go about accomplishing this sort of things. So there's really the idea that, again, this would never have been talked about just a couple of years ago, but being able to attack objects in orbit, being able to attack objects from orbit, and again, looking at space as a key national security enabler and how best to maintain mission resiliency and assurance like that.
Since you referred to this new document that came out earlier this month, Victoria, Space Force Vector, I was browsing through it. And there's a quote by General Saltzman, who's the chief of space operations at the U.S. Space Force. And he says, and I quote, "While the Space Force will continue to evolve as new technologies and missions emerge, one thing remains constant: our pursuit and attainment of space superiority." So how do you, as a think tanker, define and think about space superiority, not just from the American perspective, just from a general perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge, right? Because do we talk about ground superiority? I mean, the idea for other kind of domains and superiority, it's the idea that, okay, let's say air superiority. We want to make sure no one else can get up in the air. And that way, we can make sure that we don't have to worry about adversaries or things like that. And same to ground superiority. You want to make sure you have overwhelming force. You make sure that you can keep the other adversaries' ground troops or equipment from getting into the territory that you're disputing. But for space, you can't really do that, right? I mean, space truly is universal. Other than geostationary slots, I mean, basically any object in space is going to be going around the Earth, and so you can't say we're going to keep other entities from using space because that's pretty much impossible. You can't prevent other actors from launching. Unless you want to be there to shoot them down immediately, which that's a whole other discussion point. So I guess the question is, you're talking about space superiority. It's the idea that can you make sure that you have whatever advantages you maintain in space, that continue to have benefit from them, you have access to them, and you can maybe make sure that your space capabilities are better than adversary capabilities. That's not an official definition. I don't know even if that's possible. I don't even know if that's something you want to achieve. For example, one of the things I always talk about when I think about, again, I'm an American, so I'm going to go back to the U.S. experience. But, like, for example, a lot of what's driving U.S. Policy decisions in terms of military space, at least, is China. It's a U.S.-China relationship. And so there are a lot of people within the U.S. national security establishment that point to Chinese investment in space and Chinese actions in space and Chinese space capabilities as evidence that they are planning on, taking control of the domain, and that's a threat to the United States. And my response has always been, okay, independent of, the specific capabilities. Obviously, we need to look at things that are threatening and, counter-space capabilities and things of that nature. But just the sheer fact that China is investing a lot of stuff in space, I mean, in my opinion, that's maybe not even a good thing, but, not a scary thing because that means they have more incentive to make sure that the space domain is a stable, predictable environment. They've got more skin in the game. So, that would be actually, a concern I would have is if it's an actor that has nothing in space. Okay, they can afford to do something to destabilize the space domain, to interfere with the space capabilities because they have nothing to lose.
Um, Now that you just mentioned China, would you say that there is a kind of rivalry afoot between the United States and China? How would you characterize the US-China space relations?
I would characterize U.S. space and U.S.-China space relations as complicated. And that I think mirrors our relation on the ground or on Earth. We have a difficult relationship with China. They're a major economic power, they're a major regional power, almost a geopolitical power, but there's a lot of concerns about them from a geopolitical perspective. So, you know, it's interesting as well because in terms of military space, I think the US is very focused on China, and we speak very, very openly about things China is doing as a concern and reason why we need to do things ourselves. I don't see that as much on the Chinese side. I see them, talking about US capabilities in terms of it's threatening to them and they're concerned about their capabilities. Um, but they do a lot of things the United States does. For example, they do rendezvous and proximity operations, uncoordinated close approaches to other satellites in both low Earth orbit or LEO and geostationary orbit or GEO. The United States does that as well. Russia does that as well. China is developing its own version of Starlink. Actually, it's working on two versions, one owned by the government and one owned by the commercial sector. It just started getting launched in the past year or so. They only have about 200 satellites total, but their intention is to have about 15,000 satellites per constellation, so about the same size as Starlink. The idea is gonna develop, satellite-based, internet. They have created their own version of, GPS, their Beidou, which is a position, navigation, and timing system, or PNT system. They have created their own version of a space plane, the Shenlong space plane, like the US's X-37B. So there's a lot, and then if you read about, Chinese military thinking, they are looking what the US is doing and trying to figure out, okay, how can we make sure we're not left behind? Um, so there's that. In regards to civil space, on the other hand, particularly the moon, the US is just obsessed with getting back to the moon before China gets to the moon. And so that's been something, and that's just the heat on that discussion has been turned up a lot recently, under the current administration. They've said, NASA is not a science research organization anymore, which is kind of a crazy thing to say. Argue it is. That's a key part of its function, but that's what they're saying. They're saying no, other parts of the U.S. government can do scientific research, but we need NASA to do is we need NASA to be a human exploration organization. We want to get back to the moon and we want to get to Mars. We need to get to both those places before China does. Whereas reading and again, I'm, I'm sure the Chinese are concerned, want to get, I'm sure there's competition on the Chinese side as well. But in terms of public statements, I don't think I've seen anything from China saying we need to get to the moon before the United States does. Nothing like that. They're just like, look, we identified the moon as a goal and a priority for us, and we want to have a crewed station by 2035. We want to land on the moon by 2030. Here's these steps that we're going to get to it, and they're just chugging along the way, and again, not saying anything about the U.S. So again, I would imagine that there's competition on their end for that, but the U.S. is much more open in terms of why we want to get to the moon because of competition with China.
I've spent about a good 28 years in the space sector, of which I'd say about 15 odd years in human exploration. And I think so I briefly worked with NASA and then I was with Boeing working for the space station program. And I've been observing how China got started with its human space program in the late 90s and has had a very steadfast roadmap and trajectory. Whereas in the United States, every 4 years, when the president changes, I mean, some presidents have had two terms, but the chief of NASA changes. and many of the NASA center heads change. So often we've seen this sort of a seesaw between going to the moon versus going to Mars. And with China, you don't see any of that. They're very focused, and there is continuity in their, in their roadmaps. So I think that's a bit of an advantage for China, wouldn't you say?
I mean, yeah, for an authoritarian society, when you don't have democratic elections and changes every so often, sure, you can pick a point and just work towards it. But I do take your point in terms of consistency, that they've picked one point and they've done it. As you said, for the United States, just, the time frame that I'm working on space capabilities, we were going to go back to the moon, then we were going to go back to Mars, then we're going to the moon again, and then, oh, we're going to go to a meteor, that sort of thing. And now it's the moon, going back to Mars. And then, in terms of what NASA's raison d'etre, I think that's always been kind of a challenge, frankly, since the height of the Cold War. During the early parts of the space age, it was very clear. NASA was there because we were in a competition with the Soviet Union and we needed to get to the moon first. That was the thing. Um, and it's interesting as an American. Growing up in the end of the Cold War, I was raised to believe, yeah, we won the space race. We got to the moon first, yay. And then as an adult working on space issues, like, okay, the Soviets were the first ones to launch, the first satellite. They were the first man in space, the first woman in space. They did the first spacewalk. They did all these firsts. We just beat them by the moon by a couple months. So that was okay, kind of recalibrates how to look at that sort of thing. But yeah, so I think, and then once you have once we got to the moon, okay, I think a lot of public interest in the United States kind of ebbed, in terms of throwing all that money at NASA, because it was a huge chunk of the U.S. Budget to get there. And, there are other things going on in the 70s, Vietnam War and stuff like that. And, things were complicated. So, we kind of stopped the crewed missions to the moon, and NASA was kind of like, okay, what do we do at this point? And, the idea behind the space shuttle, I mean, at one point they were saying the space shuttle was going to do weekly launches. They had real excitement about what sort of things it was going to do, and that obviously didn't pan out. So again, this is something I think that the United States has always kind of struggled with, since, we quote won the space race, unquote, i.e. got to the moon. But yeah, I mean, I think definitely if you look at what NASA is supposed to be doing in terms of human exploration, yes, they have been kind of moving around a bit. I will say over the past 8 years or so, the Artemis program has been fairly consistent. The Artemis program was started actually under the first Trump administration, with the idea that we get the first, get people back to the moon, and kind of aiming at that point, the thinking was end of 2024, which was crazy, crazily optimistic at that point anyways. No one really thought that that would be an accomplishment. Then maybe 2025, 2026 or so. And then under the Biden administration, the Artemis program continued, but it was kind of tweaked a little bit in terms of, okay, we're going to make sure we get the first woman and the first person of color on the moon, and allies as well. And then under the second Trump administration, they say, okay, we're still going to maintain the Artemis program, but we're taking out the whole women, person of color thing. We're just get the first person back on the moon, and it's going to happen before the Chinese get there. And then also the Trump administration this time around said, okay, we're going to maintain the plans for Artemis 1, Artemis 2. Well, obviously Artemis 1's already done, 2 and 3. But after that, we're going to stop using Gateway and things like that, which had been considered a key part of the Artemis program. And frankly, a lot of our allies had invested quite a bit of money into some of the technology and products for that, with the thinking that they would be part of future exploration for the moon and beyond. So it's unclear what's going to happen after Artemis 3. I mean, it's, honestly, for the longest time, I really did think, okay, yes, the Chinese are going to get to the moon. Yeah, I have no doubt they're going to accomplish that. Roughly the time frame that they had said they would. But I figured, okay, the United States, we have a cushion. We'll do it. We'll get there, maybe 2026, 2027. But there's been problems with Starship and, all sorts of technical issues. And what I'm seeing, and I think a lot of people in the United States are starting to kind of acknowledge this, our ability to get to the moon keeps getting pushed to the right, keeps getting delayed and delayed and delayed. And that cushion between when we think we're going to get to the moon and when China is going to get to the moon is getting smaller and smaller. And now there's a lot of people saying China very likely will get to the moon before the United States does again. And I guess the overall question is, so what? Like, why does that matter? A couple things I would say. Part of it, if you're going to say the moon, the race to the moon, The US won that in 1969, but that was a long time ago, and so the question is, can the United States does it have the technological development and maturity and, enhancement to be able to get people back to the moon, which is a challenge, it's hard enough to get to the moon anyways. Only 5 countries have done that in terms of, uncrewed, satellites or robotic landers and things like that. Um, can the United States do it? For example, the Russians, they have not been on the moon for many years. They've never got a person on the moon, but in terms of having, a lander go there, and they tried a couple years ago and it crashed. And I think that's kind of emblematic of the challenges with Russia's civil space program in terms of quality control issues and, corruption issues and things like that. Like, they're really struggling. So the question is, like, if the United States can't get back to the moon before China gets to the moon, does that mean that we're having issues in terms of, being a space leader? And, what does that mean about us as a technology leader and things like that? So that's one question. The other question, and that's what the second part is what I'm hearing a lot here in the United States by people who are following, very enthusiastic about the US getting to the moon before China, is the concern that if China gets to the moon first, that they will establish norms and precedents, and they're gonna, create, the standard operating procedure for how one acts on the moon, and they're gonna change it. It's not gonna be to the US's benefit. I don't know about that, frankly. I think the moon is a very complicated operating environment to have human beings in. We've evolved to live here on Earth, but moving ourselves off planet is gonna be a real challenge. I think China will be working with the same, laws of physics that we have to, the United States has to on the moon. They signed the Outer Space Treaty just like we, did. So they have the same principles that they're working with. I don't know that necessarily that they're going to do things a lot differently, frankly, than the United States would. So that's one response to that. And the other response is, just because you get to somewhere first, sure, you can have your own things, the way you do things, but that does not mean necessarily that others will follow, right? A norm only becomes a norm if it's picked up and carried out by others. If I do one thing and no one else does it, okay, am I a leader? No, I'm just off doing my own thing. So the question is, if China gets to the moon first and starts doing all these ways in which you're doing things, will they be considered the norm setting standard? Maybe, maybe not. I would point to, for example, we had the Artemis Accords, which is the US led, non-legally binding idea that we're picking up principles from the Outer Space Treaty and saying, okay, here's how they apply for peaceful exploration of the moon and beyond. And I think there's now 60 countries that have signed on the Artemis Accords. Whereas the Chinese-Russian International Lunar Research Station, which is not quite the same thing. It's not quite, comparing apples to apples. But it is kind of similar. It's kind of, they're looking at how they want to have a crewed station on the moon, and they're looking at partners that can join in and things of that nature. And they have a considerably less number of countries that have been involved in that. I think we keep track of it. I want to say roughly 13 to 15 countries are involved in that. So it doesn't necessarily mean anything, but kind of in terms of signing on with their vision, I would say more countries have signed on to the US and the Outer Space Treaty's vision of how to do peaceful exploration. But, a lot of this is just kind of TBD. We'll see what ends up actually happening.
So I think I did hear you refer to the fact that US wants to get back to the moon before China does. But if you look at the moon landing logs in this part of the century, since 2007, China has successively, consecutively landed on the moon 6 times. And I think twice on the far side. They've had 2 sample return missions, if I'm not mistaken. And the US landings that have happened, robotic landings in this millennium, are essentially 3 private companies: Astrobotic, Firefly Aerospace, and I think Intuitive Machines. So I think when you look at that, and of course there is India with the ISRO having its Chandrayaan series, and we are planning a mission with the Japanese. There's also a Japanese private company that's landed. So I think when I look at the overall tapestry of landings, it's most of the successful landings have been by China primarily and followed by India. I would say the Japanese company also came close. But again, somehow the Eastern Hemisphere seems to, at least at this point in time, has a very focused sort of a plan for lunar exploration. And I'm concerned that given the recent cuts for NASA, Artemis might see some setbacks. I mean, I've been very involved with the American human space exploration program and the European one. So I think there could be some obstacles there, which is, similar to China. I think India also prefers to go it alone when it comes to planetary missions. And then it invites international partners to come, put a payload on their orbiter or their lander. But we don't piggyback onto other national programs such as NASA, which the Europeans do quite a bit. So I think strategically, there's a big difference in the way Asian countries such as India and China approach their planetary exploration roadmap. So, I mean, just wanted to bring in a point on just approaches, different approaches.
And I think it's definitely a really interesting point. I will point out that the U.S. companies that landed, they were largely under NASA commercial, like a commercial program, like that was done specifically. The kind of the twist is that NASA saying, look, we have a very strong, commercial space sector in the United States. Why not take advantage of those capabilities and use that to be able to do these other activities? So it's not just only a NASA thing. I will point out, for example, for the longest time, the United States could not get up to the space station after the space shuttle stopped flying. We were dependent upon the Russians, and then we went. We now we can get to the space station because we use SpaceX. So we're using a commercial company to provide government services, and that's kind of a shift in how the U.S. has approached it. But yeah, definitely,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
absolutely.
there's been more. I think, as you said, more activity on the moon, and and honestly, I think it's great. Honestly, the U.S. does not own the moon. I like to go on record as saying that. So I think the moon is part of for all of humanity, much like space is, and there's no reason why there can't be a lot of activity and actors on the moon. My concern is that we might see geopolitical competition on Earth repeating itself on the moon, and it does not necessarily have to. I think the moon is a challenging environment. I think it'd be better to be able to, if not cooperate, be able to coordinate in terms of, for spaceflight safety reasons and human spaceflight reasons, if nothing else. And we see a case point in this right now. The Chinese astronauts, the taikonauts on the Tiangong space station, they had damage done to their vehicle with space debris, and so they're up there now waiting for a replacement vehicle to come up. Now, if there had been coordination between the ISS and Tiangong, and they said, "Look, we're going to have a way in which to be able to send send one of our vehicles to your space station just for in case of an absolute emergency," that would be nice. I think that would be great. I think it'd be a really smart way of doing things. And that would be carrying out the principles of the astronaut return, treaty that's from the 1970s, but they don't. And so,
Yeah.
yeah,
No, I totally love what you just said, because that's one of the reasons why the movie The Martian by Ridley Scott, the rescue mission, if you remember, the Chinese space station plays a role in
right.
getting Matt Damon back. So I'm totally with you on that, and I think that's very important going forward for all our exploration missions. Let's shift gears a little and talk about Counterspace. What kind of counterspace capabilities do the US and its rivals possess?
Yeah. So my organization, the Secure World Foundation, every year we put out a global counterspace threat assessment where we look at open source information about counterspace capabilities around the world. I'm the editor of this report. It comes out every April. We have it available on our website for free. We've got the it's in English, but the executive summary we have translated into all 6 official UN languages in the hopes of improving transparency and understanding about capabilities. So I think every organization that does a counter space report kind of defines things differently. So how we look at it is we look at 5 different categories. We look at co-orbital counter space capabilities with the idea that a system would be put up into space, get into orbit, and then do whatever it's going to do, whether, it's going to get up close to another satellite, to look at what it's looking at, to listen to what it's broadcasting, to jam it, to do operations around it, to grab it, to interfere with this optical laser, release projectiles at a low velocity, release them at high velocity, things like that. So we look at so it can be kinetic or non-kinetic. We look at direct ascent, counterspace capability. So I think that's what a lot of people think of when they think of like anti-satellite weapons. That's what they think of. The idea that an interceptor is launched from a terrestrial base, whether it's air, sea, land, and an interceptor goes and is directed against a single satellite or let's say a single space system and tries to destroy it through sheer kinetic impact. So far, 4 countries have been able to do that: the United States, Russia, China, and India, against their own satellites, I should say. And then we look at directed energy, the idea of lasers, microwaves, stuff like that, that can be used to either do kinetically or non-kinetically interfere with space systems or capabilities. Um, there, you may have heard of news stories last year about Russia reportedly working on a nuclear warhead that, in theory, could be placed into space and be used in an anti-satellite capacity. The idea is that the detonation of the nuclear warhead would release an electromagnetic pulse, or an EMP, and that would be used to destroy satellites and increase radiation. And so that would be an example of a directed energy weapon. We can have a whole discussion about that later if we want. And then we look at electronic warfare, the idea of jamming or spoofing, and that is obviously non-destructive, non-kinetic. Pretty much everyone does that. And then we look at cyber counterspace capabilities. And again, that's non-destructive or can be non-destructive, hard to deny, hard to acknowledge who does it, things like that. So we look at those 5 different categories. So there, the too long didn't read version of our report is that there are a lot of countries working on a wide variety of research and development, even operation of counterspace capabilities, but only non-destructive ones are being used in active military conflicts. So what we're seeing, for example, like in Ukraine, we're seeing jamming and cyber being used a lot, but we haven't seen any of the co-orbital stuff or direct ascent or things like that. So there's a lot of that going on. I would say, we have 12 countries in our report. As I said before, only 4 countries have done destructive anti-satellite tests: the US, Russia, India, and China. But we have other countries that are expressing interest in developing, they have a military space organization, so looking at doing jamming, or we're seeing a lot of countries talking about having guardians, quote unquote, on orbit. So the idea of co-orbital counterspace capabilities, things like that. So there's a lot going on. We're seeing a lot of, as I said before, rendezvous and proximity operations, RPO activities, which when we're looking at military RPO activities, Secure World Foundation includes those as co-orbital counterspace capabilities, because again, you could be getting up close to another satellite because you're trying to refuel it, or maybe add on a life extension vehicle, or you're trying to get up to a dead satellite to remove debris. Okay, yes, but those capabilities could also be used to, as I said before, get up close and interfere. So it's a real challenge, because a lot of these capabilities are kind of dual purpose. They can be built for one thing, but used another way. And so all you have to work off is intention. So there's a lot going on. And I think also, interestingly enough, as we see the rise of commercial space situational awareness companies, we're having more inputs. We're having more ability to see what's going on in space. It's not just, okay, you have to get whatever the governments are saying in terms of, SSA capability. And so, for example, just last week, a U.S. company, Slingshot Aerospace, said, okay, we see this Russian satellite in MEO, a medium Earth orbit, and they haven't, they've released something that they haven't put on the catalog. Historically, that would be something that the U.S. government or the Russian would frankly only be able to do. And whether or not they'd share that sort of information publicly, probably unclear. But, because there's commercial actors that can do it, they can release that kind of information. And it's not just the West. India's got some really strong SSA companies. Dejantara is one of them. And so I think it's been interesting seeing this democratization of understanding what's going on in orbit. I think it's helpful in terms of, it's not just government saying this. You have commercial, you have separate separate viewpoints that can bring in, products to bear there.
So in April of 2022, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris, who was then chairing the National Space Council, said U.S. will stop testing missiles designed to destroy spacecraft in orbit. And my understanding is that that particular U.S. commitment was not to conduct destructive direct ascent ASAT missile tests. And it's the testing part that the moratorium was proposed on, and not the development. And it's not all ASATs, just the destructive DA ASAT ones. Can you elaborate a bit on that? Why ban testing and not development, and why only DA ASATs and not the other genres of ASATs?
Sure, and just with the understanding, I'm not a spokesperson for the U.S. government, just as an outside analyst. This is how I understand this is happening. The destructive anti-satellite missile tests, those have been some of the biggest creators of debris on orbit that we've seen from, anti-satellite tests. My organization, the Secure World Foundation, we keep track of all the destructive anti-satellite tests that have been held, beginning of the space age. There've been roughly 20 of them. Of that, I think there's over 6,800 pieces of trackable debris that have been created from these tests. And trackable is an important distinction there, because there's no doubt debris that's too small to track that could still be very dangerous to spacecraft, just based on the speeds, in orbit that objects travel. And of those pieces of debris they've created, about 2,900 are still around. And some of them have been around since the 1960s, and they're going to be around for decades. One of the biggest creator, that was frankly the Chinese ASAT test in 2007, which was a direct descent anti-satellite test, with a missile. And that was done at a high enough altitude, about, I think, 860 kilometers or so, that the debris is going to be around for a long time, decades, if not centuries at this point. To grossly oversimplify, as me with my political science degree, it's my understanding the higher up you go, the longer it takes for things to come down. So if you do an anti-satellite missile test at a lower orbit, stuff will enter the Earth's atmosphere relatively quickly as opposed to further up. Case in point, India's 2019 anti-satellite test was done at a low enough orbit that the debris that was created from the test re-entered within about 3 years or so. So, it was at a lower orbit. So I think, kind of that was, and the concern, of course, we don't really have a way in which to get rid of debris at this point. There are a lot of actors working on, developing debris removal technologies, but these are things like removing a big piece, one thing, or possibly, getting little pieces of debris, but not all in one fell swoop. No one is saying we're developing a technology that's going to let us pick out thousands of pieces of debris at one time. Like no one's saying that. And so if you're concerned about your ability to operate in space due to, deliberately created debris, the only way to keep that from being an issue is to keep the debris from being created in the first place. So I think that was the impetus for this moratorium. And then, this policy, as you said, came out in April 2022. In November 2021, Russia had its direct descent anti-satellite missile test that created over, against one of its own satellites, that created over 1,800 pieces of trackable debris. And so I think that, I would guess that was the thing that kind of really incentivized the U.S. to have the discussion internally, the interagency process, to say, okay, this is something that we should probably say we're not going to do anymore. So, when the U.S. made the commitment not to conduct destructive and direct descent anti-satellite missile tests, I think that was the saying, okay, we're going to say, we understand that this action is, because of the results from it, can be very destabilizing. It creates debris that everyone has to operate in. It threatens all actors who are in that orbit, whether or not they're an ally or a rival of the entity that created that debris. And so we're going to say, look, we're going to do a moratorium on this kind of testing. As you said, Susmita, it says nothing about, other kinds of, anti-satellite testing. It's anything other about developing the capability. But, I think that goes back to how the U.S. has historically looked at threats to space security and stability. And this goes back to the early 1980s when the UN General Assembly started looking at the Prevention of Arms Race in Outer Space, or PAROS. The U.S. has always looked at actions as being what they think is being more destabilizing. And this is opposed to countries like Russia and China, who look at, we're looking at the technology, the actual capability as the threat. So the U.S. made this commitment. 38 countries have also made the commitment not to conduct destructive anti-satellite missile tests. There was a UN General Assembly resolution in December 2022. 155 countries voted in support, just saying, look, we think this is a bad idea. We encourage others not to do it. My organization, the Secure World Foundation, we coordinated an industry statement of support because, commercial actors have to operate in space. And, for example, going back to the year or so after Russia's 2021 test, there were so many pieces of debris, basically all the remote sensing satellites in the low Earth orbit, sun synchronous orbit, were threatened with, close approaches or conjunctions. And there were so many close approaches that a commercial SSA company described those conjunction squalls. The idea that, in a certain period of time, there'd be almost thousands, if not tens of thousands of close approaches. So we said, okay, commercial actors, you've invested a lot. It's a complicated domain. There's this commitment to not create debris that could threaten you. Would you like, maybe to underline how important it is that, that this is happening, and do you want to sign this statement of support? Um, and so we released it in November 2023. I think we had 26 companies at that point. We've since had more companies and countries sign on. We've got, I think, 54 companies from 17 countries have signed on. And again, the question would be like, well, why does that matter? If most of these entities that have signed on to this or said this moratorium, that they wouldn't be testing anyways. For example, I think the US made the commitment, and I think the second country to make the commitment was New Zealand. Like, no one thinks New Zealand is going to be conducting sort of ASAP missile tests. Why does that matter? And so I think, but big picture, this is how norms of behavior and ideas of common, responsibility in space, this is how they get created, right? People say, look, this is something we find so destabilizing. We think it's a bad idea, and we ourselves are going to hold ourselves to not doing it, and then as you get more and more actors agreeing to that, you kind of get a groundswell of support. And that's how you get to, I wouldn't say customary international law, but that's how you get like a common understanding. Like, this is something, responsible space actors do not do. And so it's not going to solve space security. There's no one silver bullet, no one approach that's going to make space secure and stable for all. But I think this is an important, leg up there. And so if you see in discussions at the United Nations on, responsible behavior in space, largely in Geneva at the Conference of Disarmament, a lot of countries are saying, look, the idea of deliberately creating debris in orbit, that's a bad idea. It's good, bad form. We don't want to see it happening. And again, a lot of these countries probably would never do it to begin with. But again, that's how you go about accomplishing that. Now, from a realistic viewpoint as well, I think this is a very savvy move by the United States, because I do agree that I think these sort of tasks create debris, and that's a challenge, it's threatening, and that sort of thing. But also, like, this sort of capability, it's really hard to use, from a military utility viewpoint. Um, and so you're not giving up too much by saying you're not going to do it, right? Because, if you use a direct ascent anti-satellite missile, and you use it to hit, but then again, this has never happened, but say you were to use it you're in a conflict, you say, okay, I'm going to take out this one satellite of my adversary and use an anti-satellite missile to do it. And so you hit it, first of all, you create a ton of debris. And this is, in theory, a domain that you yourself have to operate in. So you just made it a lot harder for yourself to work. But also, you have no plausible deniability that was you. I mean, we can tell very easily where the missile was launched. Unlike, jamming or Counterspace, you can be like, oh, who can say, a lot of times we don't know necessarily who's involved in, like, these sort of activities. I mean, you can guess, you can have a pretty good idea, but there's still plausible deniability. And I would say, an example of that would be when Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, there was a cyber attack against Viasat's ground terminals at that time, with the thinking most people thought, okay, that's Russia trying to interfere with Ukrainian military communications. The US and the EU came out in May 2022 and said, we have identified that Russia was a perpetrator behind the cyber attack. Russia's never acknowledged it. They've plausibly denied it. But with the direct ascent anti-satellite, you have the missile, you have none of that. So it's a challenge to use. You have no plausible deniability, and so it's not really, I would argue, it's not really a usable a tool in your toolkit. So why not say, well, we're not going to use it anyways, and we're not going to test it just to say. I would say the reason why also, the United States didn't say we're not going to develop it is that, frankly, a lot of these capabilities are very tied to missile defense. For example, in 2008, when the United States conducted Burnt Frost, and we shot down a satellite that was, dead, and officially it was done for space flight safety reasons, although I would argue it was done in response to China's 2007 test. Be that as it may, basically we reconfigured one of our sea-based missile defense interceptors, the SM-3, which is on the Aegis ballistic missile defense system, and used that in an anti-satellite capacity. And so I think the concern, if you say, well, we're going to be against developing these sort of capabilities that would tie into missile defense, and that's always been kind of the third rail for the United States in terms of security discussions.
So let's talk about the plans for the Golden Dome that President Trump has been talking about. So the Golden Dome, from what I understand, I mean, it imagines a space-based shield of interceptors to defend against missiles. How does that vision of space-based interceptors differ from ASAT weapons, technically and in terms of escalation risks, debris proliferation, and broader strategic stability?
Yeah, so right now, it's still unclear what Golden Dome is going to entail. Kind of if you look at the executive order that initially started all this back in January of this year, it was considered an Iron Dome for America. With the idea that you'd have an integrated missile defense shield that would protect against everything, and that would be ground, sea base, air base, and then space based parts as well. Now, I did talk about at that point a space based interceptor layer, and that's kind of uh, what has been different, frankly, because, the US already has a missile defense architecture. We have our ground-based mid-course defense system, which is intended to defend against the US homeland against ICBM attack. You have the Patriot systems, which are intended to defend against regional, shorter range ballistic missiles. You have the Aegis, which is largely medium ballistic missiles, and as I said before, they've had some reconfigurations to do anti-satellite. You have the THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, which is intended to defend against regional, but, terminal attack. So that all is not new. Even the space-based sensor layer that already exists, and the US is working on a couple different options to upgrade it. But the part that's new, as you identified, would be the space-based interceptor layer. This is not the first time the US has played around with that sort of thinking. During the 1980s, under the Reagan administration, they talked about Strategic Defense Initiative or Star Wars. Again, the same idea that you'd have a space-based interceptor layer that'd be up there. And that changed into Brilliant Pebbles under the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, and then kind of got kicked aside under the Clinton administration when the U.S. shifted more towards short-range ballistic missiles. Again, that was during the first Gulf War when we need to defend against short-range ballistic missiles and theater missile defense. So, but it's unclear, but it is something's going to happen. That's one thing I keep talking about. The U.S. is going ahead with this from the U.S. perspective very quickly. They nominated General Getline to be like the Golden Dome czar. So he was nominated in the summer, and he was given 60 days to come up with an initial architecture and to brief Congress of that. And so that was mid-September, like September 17th. That was like 60 days to the dot. He briefed Congress. That has not been made open, but the thinking is it is going to be, a large missile defense with a bunch of different regional missile defenses put in, and then also a space-based interceptor layer. So, and then in theory, he had 6 days from them to give a thorough briefing to Congress in terms of what exactly it's going to entail. And I believe that 60-day period ended like last week or so. So right now we're doing this on November 22nd, so past week or so. But we had the U.S. government shut down for 6 weeks. I don't know if that affected that, blah, blah, blah. But the U.S. is moving ahead, and there will be some sort of space-based interceptor layer. They had been charged by Trump to get this, he said, fully operational by the time he leaves office, which is not going to happen. But they also have been charged to have an integrated systems test by early November 2028, which, if you're paying attention, for the U.S., that has a significance because that's the next presidential election is early November 2028. So he wants to have it before then. But it's, I think basically what it's going to do is going to put together all the different missile defense systems that we already have and kind of make it an integrated architecture and tie in the sensor layer and things like that. But then they also want to build some sort of interceptor system. And now the problem with the SBI, space-based interceptors, for boost phase intercept, is that boost phase is a fairly short time frame. It's maybe 3 minutes, 4 minutes for, depending on it's solid fueled, liquid fueled ICBMs, which means you don't have a lot of time to actually be there. And just because interceptors are orbiting the planet, the Earth is rotating, you have what's called the absentee issue in terms of, you might not have an interceptor above the area where the launch is going to happen and the time frame to make the intercept in, the 3 minutes that you have, which means you have to have a lot of interceptors to make sure you're covered. Um, Previously as well, the US had focused on missile defense, like in terms of like, you know, I think defending against the US, the homeland against attack, ICBM attack. We were looking at rogue states. So countries like Iran or North Korea, which are considerably smaller, particularly North Korea, very thin and narrow. But now they're looking at peer rivals. And so that's Russia and China. That's a lot of territory to have to cover, right? So it's going to need a lot of interceptors up in orbit. A lot of it just depends in terms of how fast you think the target missile is going to be launching and how much time you're going to give yourself. But kind of big picture, we're looking at roughly 1,000 interceptors for each target they're trying to get rid of. And so, but each launch. So if you're going to have one launch, that's 1,000 interceptors. But if you're going to do two launches, like if you're going to have at the same time, you're looking at 2,000. And so I mean, it's scaled up so quickly. And it's an insane amount of money that's going to be cost on this. Officially, Trump said $175 billion, but there's been a really good analysis done by a U.S. Think tank person, Todd Harrison, who looked at, he's a military budget guy. And so he looked at, okay, all the different elements and what could be. And he broke them down what they could cost. And he said, okay, let's do the smallest scenario, right? That's a very limited defense against basically air-breathing threats. Doesn't include a space-based interceptor layer at all. And that was going to be something like $220 billion over 20 years. That's the lowest one. And then they said, okay, medium, let's look at the kind of the medium, sort of thing. Some space-based stuff, not a lot. We'll figure out, they'll defend against strategic threats, things like that. That's about $1 trillion over 20 years. Then he said, okay, let's look at, building out the system that Trump has been talking about, kind of every threat, strategic, ICBM, near-peer rivals, space-based, et cetera, et cetera. And he was looking at that could be run to $3.3 trillion over 20 years. Like there's so much money involved. It is crazy. But going back to your question about, these interceptors, are they actual weapons placed in space? Yes, they absolutely are. And, that's the point I've been arguing is that these interceptors, I think there's a challenge, based on everything I just said earlier in terms of using them in boost space missile defense. But these interceptors point up as well as pointing down. And so I think, frankly, they could also be used in an anti-satellite capacity. And so, one of the biggest threats Russia and China have been concerned about for years are the idea of, basically weapons that are designed and placed in orbit, essentially space-based missile defense interceptors. And they put out this draft treaty in 2008, the Prevention of Placement of Weapons in Space. The acronym is the PPWT. It's kind of been limping along and hasn't progressed much, but that's what they've been focused on. But I mean, this is that exact scenario that they've been talking about. And as an American, for me, it's very frustrating because the United States has the most to lose by putting weapons in space because we depend the most heavily on space-based systems for national security reasons, for our economy to function, things like that. And by crossing that Rubicon, by putting an actual designed weapon in space where there's, as opposed to a capability, right, which is what's happening right now. But there's no dispute, like this is a weapon placed in space. We're opening up that box to, this sort of thing happening. Now, I don't see, by other actors, I don't see necessarily Russia developing space-based interceptors. Frankly, they're a little busy at the time. They're having issues with, export control and things like that, and sanctions, and their money and resources are going elsewhere, and et cetera. So, but I would not be surprised, if there are hawks in China pointing to this and saying, we should probably be looking into this as well. And that's not good. That's not a good precedent to set for the United States. From a purely selfish viewpoint, as an American, I don't like that. And, I don't know that they will. I haven't seen to be clear, I've not seen anything on record as saying that they will. And both China and Russia have come out very heavily over the past couple of months of criticizing the United States for Golden Dome. We talked about the idea, space be a peaceful domain, et cetera, et cetera. But just how, here in the United States, I hear people talk about, well, China's investing a lot in space-based solar power, so we need to invest in space-based solar power just to make sure. Whereas I'm like, let them throw their money away in space-based solar power. I'm happy to see them do it on something that's not going to pan out. And frankly, that means that it's a resource they can't put elsewhere. But I think there might be some people in China doing that same argument. So, which is not great for, frankly, anyone. Again, the concern with, space security and stability, yes, there's a geopolitical superpower competition element to it. But everyone, every single person on this planet is a user of space data and services in some way, shape, or form. And so something that weaponizes and, destabilizes the domain has the potential to affect everyone. And so this is a concern for everyone, not just the United States, not just China, not just Russia, not just India, everyone.
Um, One of your areas of interest, Victoria, is nuclear weapons reductions. And recently, President Trump announced, clearly he's very busy. He announced his decision to restart nuclear testing after a 30-year pause. This announcement has sent the other nuclear powers scrambling to figure out what their nuclear strategy ought to be. We have Russian President Putin, who's been trading threats with President Trump about restarting their nuclear tests. We had Washington Post report about China looking at expanding a nuclear test site as Trump revives this Cold War tension. In Delhi, ORF, our think tank, published a piece that looks at implications for India. So, while this dangerous nuclear theater is playing out, we are also aware of a deadline that's around the corner. I mean, next February, on the 4th of February, the only remaining nuclear arms control agreement between the US and Russia is set to expire. So, are we at a threshold of a new nuclear arms race? What do you think?
I very much hope not. um, it's unclear. With Trump, you never know. You know, what he was referring to, frankly. We talked about the US, saying Russia and China is doing nuclear tests, and so we need to do it as well. We need to restart it. You know, it is unclear whether he got confused and saw, Russia launching a test of a nuclear cruise missile and got that confused with nuclear testing. There are a lot of people scrambling. It's like, oh, well, he meant criticality, nuclear criticality tests. And like, I promise you, Trump was not looking at criticality, at that sort of level. Like, no. So that is not, and also, frankly, the U.S. has been doing, under the National Nuclear Security Administration, has been doing, tests to make sure our nuclear arsenal is safe and dependable. So it's not, we haven't had like a nuclear explosion since you said the early 90s, but we have an actual, it doesn't mean that we can't have um, confidence in our nuclear weapons stockpile. And as far as I know, DOE, Department of Energy, has not, which is in charge of the nuclear stockpile, they have not indicated that they will be doing this sort of thing. So I don't know if I don't know if that's officially you can say, yes, U.S. policy has changed. We have our president saying something that is not clear what exactly he was talking about, and there's no policy buildup to actually lead up to that. And in theory, the United States still has, policies that we have to follow, right? You can't just have the president tweet something and then we have to go out and do it. Although it's been a wild 8 months, 9 months, so things have changed. But your overall point about how I think right, new start coming to possible an end next year, actually in a couple months, it is a concern. Now, just in the past week or so, the U.S. put out its strategy for peace with Ukraine and Russia, and one of the things they talked about is continuing the discussions for Start One. And you're like, okay, Start One is not New Start. That's a treaty from like decades ago. Did you mix them up? So frankly, that does not bode well in terms of the administration's knowledge of nuclear arms control discussions. But we'll see. But it is, I think, overall speaking, it is a concern that there's a possibility for there being no big arms control treaties, between, let's face it, the two biggest superpowers when it comes to nuclear weapons, Russia and the United States still are there. China has, it's a third, but it's a distant third. And, New START didn't deal with China. It was strictly bilateral. So if relations are bad between the United States and Russia, and we have this cushion or, this speed bump, by the treaty going away, what does that mean in terms of overall strategic stability? It's a question mark.
I guess we'll find out whether it was a political stunt on President Trump's part to project toughness and sow confusion. We'll figure out soon enough. Finally, Victoria, crystal ball question: what will the future of space warfare look like in 2050?
Yeah, so that's 25 years from now. Honestly, I'm gonna say not necessarily warfare, but again, capabilities and kind of gray zone conflict. We're just kind of not quite active conflict, but there's hostility and tension in space. So I think a lot more countries are going to be developing counter space capabilities. We're going to see a lot more out there. I will point out from the Secure World Foundation's counter space report, when we first started it in 2018, we had 6 countries. As of this year, we have 12, and I think next year we're going to add a couple more. And there's always more and more countries looking at. So I think a lot more countries are looking to invest into offensive counter space capabilities. So I think we're going to see a lot more actors with this kind of capabilities. I think it's going to be a high state of tension. But my hope is, during the height of the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union understood that, interfering with national technical means of verification was so destabilizing that they agreed not to do it. And so, even though we had like 1,000 nuclear weapons tests, we had very limited amount of anti-satellite tests, and we managed to keep space from from warfare going to space during the height of the Cold War. So my hope is, in 2050, space is going to be so heavily integrated into everyone's lives that even though you will have this high level of tension, it is not guaranteed that space will be weaponized. It is not guaranteed that there will be conflict in space or warfare in space. And it is my hope that we'll continue to see people getting the benefits and use of space over the long term.
Thank you. Thank you, Victoria. It's been a real pleasure talking to you about very many topics. I mean, some of these, like Counterspace and space interceptors, they're very exciting to read about, but I think it's always nice to hear from an expert. Thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I appreciate you putting this information out there for the world. Thank you.
Thank you all for listening. Stay tuned for our next episode. Refer to our website, spaceportsarabhai.org, for more discussions, debates, dialogues, an explainer series, the new Space India podcast, and a newsletter about the progress of India's space program.